Greetings. My name is Eric Prince. I'm an American, I'm a former Navy SEAL, and I'm the founder of Blackwater. I've paid close attention to peace in Afghanistan since 1998, when I funded Aloya Jirga to negotiate an end to the civil war raging across the country. We encouraged King Zahir Shah to return from exile and bring closure to the Afghan civil war. 39 years of Afghanistan at war is enough. The Afghan people deserve better. After 17 years, thousands of dead Americans, tens of thousands of dead Afghans, and trillions of dollars, it is safe to say that we as a nation have exhausted the conventional approach. The U.S. rightly came to Afghanistan after the unprovoked 9/11 attack, at the core of American society. The only U.S. desire for Afghanistan is a peaceful, self-governing country that is in control of its entire terrain. The Afghan people cannot be betrayed. Having fought against the Soviets through the 80s and radical Islam since, they have demonstrated their commitment to live free from oppression. The country's position between tyrannical Iran and unstable Pakistan makes political stability a geopolitical imperative. Sadly, anyone who lives outside a secure compound knows how dangerous Afghanistan has become. Whether it's daily bombings, assassinations, raids, and ambushes, the death toll is going the wrong way for the Afghan people. Even government facilities in the heart of Kabul are not safe. After 9/11, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda forces were devastated in lightning-fast military operations conducted by patriotic Afghan militias fighting alongside the CIA and U.S. Special Forces. Since then, an over-focus on building a central government has left significant problems throughout the country, including governance, corruption, and security forces that control barely 30% of the Afghan terrain. With 70% of Afghanistan under the influence of the Taliban or Daesh or others, we clearly have a problem. Any objective observer can see plainly what's not working: conventional military tactics with centralized decision-making. For all the failings of the Afghan National Security Forces, there are components that work well. The Afghan commando units, trained and mentored for years by their U.S. Special Operations brothers, fight well, conducting 70% of all offensive combat missions. In 17 years of involvement, the numbers of enemy forces have steadily risen. The numbers of armed insurgents now is at least 60,000, way up from 2014 despite an aggressive air campaign by the U.S. As Daesh has suffered setbacks in the Middle East, the foreign radicals are coming to Afghanistan. Rising number of foreign fighters, including those from North and Western Africa, really has stretched the Afghan security forces. Our cutting-edge technology is not enough. We are being defeated by a largely illiterate and under-equipped enemy with no formal training, riding motorbikes and armed with simple or homemade weaponry. My older Afghan friends tell me that after so much war, the ethnic division in the country has never been this bad. The neighbors, Pakistan and Iran, are not being helpful. For all the talk of pressuring Pakistan to sever their support of the Taliban and the Haqqanis, the reality is the U.S. can't apply that much pressure because the U.S. military is totally dependent on the logistics lines running across Pakistan. There are real doubts about the international community's ability to sustain the effort. NATO has never met half of its field mentor commitments, and most nations are just going through the motions. The U.S. spends more now on just Afghanistan than for its entire Department of Homeland Security, or even more in Afghanistan than the entire Great Britain defense budget. With the United States approaching $21 trillion in debt and having spent almost $6 trillion in defense since 9/11, the U.S. cannot economically or politically sustain this amount of ineffective waste. A different, more effective path must be taken now to prevent U.S. politics from souring support for Afghanistan, as happened at the end of U.S. involvement in Vietnam or even Iraq. A sharp change in approach must be made to prevent the double chaos of terrorism and corruption from destroying the Afghan people. After the 9/11 attacks, a couple hundred CIA and Special Forces soldiers, backed by U.S. air power, decimated the Taliban in a matter of weeks. By January 2002, when thousands of uniformed conventional forces rolled in, progress against the Taliban has really ground to a halt. After 16 commanders in 17 years, tens of thousands of dead and wounded, and trillions in spending, it's time to pursue a different path. Different from the continuous loop, conventional DoD approach that we've done for the last 17 years. There are currently almost 15,000 U.S. forces in Afghanistan, supported by nearly 30,000 contractors. And at the peak, the U.S. had 140,000 U.S. and NATO forces in country. I recommend a rationalization of the effort to a much smaller, more nimble and effective capability, reminiscent of what worked in the months after 9/11. We need to do three things immediately to strengthen the Afghan security forces. First, embedded mentors. Second, deploy reliable air power. And third, governance support. What does that look like? Embedded mentors. The U.S. and NATO forces are currently in their 30th rotation of troops, where a Western soldier arrives in Afghanistan for approximately 7-month deployment. They need a few months to get familiar with the area, only to leave a few months later, never to return. America has not been at war for 17 years, but rather 30 different deployments, 7 months at a time. The only alternative is using former Western veterans as contracted mentors. They would serve for years with the same Afghan battalion, living with, training with, patrolling, and yes, even fighting alongside their Afghan counterparts. They would provide the key enablers, leadership, intelligence, communications, medical and logistics support at the bottoms up to each Afghan unit. The Afghan commandos are trained and mentored in the field by their U.S. Special Forces counterparts. That approach works. My approach extends this to the entire Afghan army with mentors who will be attached for the long term. They'll make sure the Afghan units are paid, fed, well-led, and supplied on time. The mentors will be the same guys working with the same Afghan unit for years, not months, under Afghan rules of engagement in Afghan uniforms. The embedded mentor model removes the irritant of foreign occupation forces. No longer do you need thousands of U.S. and NATO forces to be required on Afghan soil. No longer are conventional U.S. forces rolling around the Afghan countryside as targets for ambush. Air enablers, okay? Afghan Air Force had a very late start in growing with really no development until the last few years. They are still a long ways from where they need to be. To this day, Afghan units are routinely annihilated by enemy units with no air power manages to arrive in a timely manner. Afghan commanders under siege resort to calling Afghan media programs to plead for rescue, and usually nothing comes. That commander, after days of siege, makes the tragic decision to surrender his unit and hope for mercy from the enemy instead of fighting on. This is not a theoretical idea for me. I used to have dozens of my own aircraft in country and more than 70 around the world providing that kind of support to U.S. forces. Focused air support will provide a huge lift of Afghan fighting capability. Men who know help is coming will fight harder. Our new approach will provide immediate, reliable, and low-cost aircraft flown by blended crews, a professional Western safety pilot, and an Afghan on board with sole authority for the release of weapons. And the third part is governance support. Soldiers that are being taken care of have a much higher reliability than the massive corruption that engulfs the Afghan forces now. Ghost soldiers continue to bleed payroll, as well as the corruption in the basic logistics contracts of the Afghan security forces. The most tragic are the stories of Afghan war widows going to collect their insurance benefits and being required to perform sex acts by corrupt Afghan payroll officers. There is no punishment too severe for this evil. Assigning long-term professional accounting and logistics professionals to each of those contracting and disbursement functions, like the excellent work of the Afghan Inspector General from the U.S., is that kind of solution for the gross waste. The U.S. should support the Afghan forces at the local, district, and provincial level, from the bottoms up, not from the top down. NATO and U.S. presidents will not last forever. We've got to put this effort on a sustainable footing. Fighting like politics in Afghanistan is local. Some peripheral Taliban elements are willing to consider a ceasefire, but they need reintegration and even protection from the hardcore Taliban, Haqqani, or ISI masters. The hardcore radical elements don't want peace and don't deserve it. They must be destroyed. But the Afghan Taliban that do want to reconcile must be protected after they make peace, because if not, they will be slaughtered. Strength attacks strength, and the endless failures of the Kabul government makes everyone uncertain of Afghanistan's future. The strategic economy of force for the Afghan forces costs a fraction of what the U.S. is squandering now, utilizing about 6,000 contractors embedded with the Afghan military versus the 45,000 foreign personnel currently in the country. To enact this approach, President Trump should appoint a special presidential envoy and empower them to wage an unconventional war against the Taliban and Daesh forces, to hold the corrupt officials accountable, and to negotiate with their Afghan counterparts and with the Afghan Taliban that are willing to reconcile with Kabul. As the skeletal support of mentors and air power and governance stand up, the conventional DoD and NATO forces can go home, leaving a much, much smaller footprint. The president rightly campaigned on ending America's endless wars. The Afghan people pay the highest price, and we need to make this work for the benefit of all of our children. An approach like this is the only way that will happen. The president can responsibly, legally, and cost-effectively end America's longest war while saving thousands of lives, and hundreds of billions of dollars. I challenge the inevitable naysayers to provide a better option. Thank you for listening, and I hope we soon get to work together to return peace and freedom to the Afghan people.